The next gentleman I have to introduce here is going to talk about setting up for online assessment testing for using your Macs, something that is impacting a lot of schools across the country, whether you are a Park user or a Smarter Balanced testing user. The concepts that he's going to go over, I think, transcend across those two different systems, and to think about it systematically. So I'd like to introduce Jason Agress, Network Specialist from Newton Public Schools.
Thanks, Trey. So not only do I have to follow IBM, but lunch is next. So I'll do my best to get us out of here. And then I'm talking about standardized testing, so it's sort of like, you know, but bear with me. I think it will be fun, and you know, I'm really happy to be here, not only because I'm amongst my peers of Mac admins, but also because I'm amongst my peers of IT admins in education. And I think I was saying to Trey earlier that working in education is really cool because unlike in a corporate culture, you know, we all want to collaborate with each other and learn from each other. And I've loved learning from people so far at JNUC, and I really hope that some people can learn from me today from this, and hopefully not have to go through some of the same work that I did last year to prepare for Park in Newton Public Schools. So a little bit about me. I'm a network media specialist in Newton, and one of the things I do is administer the Casper suite. And Newton is a fairly large district in a suburb right outside Boston. We have 21 schools, about 13,000 students, 2,000 staff, 18 like administrative tech staff, 14 technology integration teachers, and then we're predominantly Mac environments. So Macs were sort of the obvious choice for our Park deployment. So 6,200 Macs, far fewer PCs, 900. We didn't use them for Park. 2,000 iPads, 600 Chromebooks, and our Casper infrastructure is virtualized in VMware on Cisco UCS and NetApp running Ubuntu. And it's really solid, and it was really fundamental to making our deployment go well. So everything I'm talking about today, the slideshow, I'm going to show some scripts later. And by the way, the scripts are not beautiful, but you're welcome to borrow from them. Are at this URL, so don't feel like you have to write something down if you see it on the screen, except do write down the URL. So today I'm going to talk about 4 things. The first is some background around the challenges of preparing for online testing, the context of it, and also what our sort of tangible end goals are. And then also the project timeline to provide additional context about where we started, what we did, and where we ended. And then based on that project timeline, some lessons learned. And in my mind, this is sort of the most important part of the session is like, what worked? What should other people be doing to facilitate a successful online testing deployment? And then finally, and even though the last part was, I think, the most important, this is going to be the most fun, are the technical examples and the way we've used the Casper suite in order to facilitate this deployment. So there's also 4 core values sort of at the heart of everything we do in IT in Newton, but these are sort of fundamental also to our online testing experience. And we didn't really articulate them as we started, but rather as we went about things, we sort of inherently felt shaped by these values. So one was focusing on teaching and learning. So we're a school district. Our end goal in general is to support teaching and learning. And the people who are doing that, who are the teachers and students. And so we always went back to that. How is what we're doing supporting the teachers and students? And then everyone in my department, it's kind of an inside joke, but we read this book called Teaming by Amy Edmondson out of Harvard Business School. And it's actually a really, really good book. And chapter 5 is called Failing Better to Succeed Faster. And this entire deployment was about failing. We failed way more than we succeeded. And the good news is we succeeded in the end, but it took a lot of failure and learning along the way. And so that was really important to the process. Also, a big term in education for any of you teachers or folks who work with teachers out there is growth mindset. which is fundamentally about dedication and hard work. And I think that sort of goes for any industry and any task that you have, but particularly with this project, it was really important for us to be dedicated and work hard and sort of keep at it and not get discouraged. And through that process of working hard and being dedicated, sort of becoming better at what we're doing and improving our processes. And then finally, from a technical perspective, is Agile software development. We really didn't follow a traditional sort of project management development approach to this project. Instead, it was also not on purpose, but it turned out to be an Agile process. And to talk a little bit about what an Agile software development process is, it's focused more on individuals' interactions over processes and tools, working software, so it's being functional, customer collaboration, and for us that was our stakeholders, teachers, students, administrative staff, testing coordinators. That was really important, is working with them. And then absolutely, I talked about failing to succeed, responding to change. So every time we failed, we had to respond to that and do something to make it better for the future. So one of the categories of challenges was administrative and organizational. And so it's like, what does it all mean? Like, we in IT didn't really have a choice to implement standardized testing online. State mandated means it's mandated. And so that was one of the challenges, was a deadline we didn't have control over, and expectations that we didn't have control over. There were also, and this is obviously the case in like any technology situation or any business situation in the world, is limited human resources. And in my case, that was IT staff. So I talked about that staff of about 17 people in our department, but they all have other projects to do and other priorities. So we had to think about how would we best leverage our human resources to effectively support the technology needed for testing. And a huge part of that was leveraging the Casper suite. There were also sort of environmental and educational challenges sort of inherent to working in schools. And one of those is varying familiarity with computer-based testing. So we had some teachers who had taken like MTEL, like state certification exams online in testing centers before, but really our students hadn't done more than like a KIA quiz online or something in our LMS, certainly not sort of a fully proctored online test. We also sort of strived, and sort of going back to our core value of supporting teachers and students, we really, really wanted to support our students by having a seamless user experience for them. It was bad enough that they have to sit there for hours taking a test. We didn't want the technology to increase the burden on them in doing that. And then finally, we're not a one-to-one environment. We're lots of shared laptop carts, lots of 5-packs in elementary classrooms. And so the machines are all over the place, and they're being opened and closed and moved from one place to another and on the wireless and off the wireless. And keeping track of them from an asset management standpoint is difficult, but also getting software and settings out to them. So that was definitely something that we had to work on. And then there were sort of two tangible end goals. I talked about sort of our overarching goals and some of the challenges, but in the end, we needed a seamless user experience. We needed students to be able to walk into the room at the beginning of the testing session, log in, take the test, log out, and leave. And from a technology standpoint, that's what it had to look like. And then from a technical implementation standpoint, it had to be manageable. We couldn't be going with flash drives from machine to machine, setting things up. We couldn't be going through a paper checklist and configuring things manually. In the end, we had about 1,600 machines that were used for testing, and we needed to get them deployed and configured fairly quickly. So just to give you a sense of the variety of tools that went into implementing this project in terms of Mac management in Casper, we used the JSS, extension attributes, bash scripts, the Jamf binary, smart groups, packages, DMG, scripts, self-service, the REST API, you name it, we used it. I think we really pushed the limits of the Casper suite in terms of the number of tools that we leveraged to our benefit, and it was really, really powerful, and that's, I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit more of that soon. So when we first heard about starting this whole park thing in Newton, we started by investigating requirements. And originally the slide said define requirements, and I changed it because we didn't really define them. We didn't really know what they had to be. We had to like figure them out. And so it was much more of an exploratory process. And that involved attending webinars from the state and from Pearson, meeting with central staff from our education center, meeting with teachers, principals, and trying out the sample test that Pearson made available to us. And then we moved on to the initial development. So I said, well, now that we know, what it's supposed to look like theoretically, let's come up with a deployment scenario where I can press a button and it makes it so I can do that. And so we came up with a first draft of what it would look like from a Casper and Mac management standpoint of that deployment. And then that whole sense of agile development is really important here because everything was a revisioning process. Every phase of testing resulted in tons of more revisioning. So phase 1 of testing, it was sort of bench testing, but I call it dining room table testing because it was during a snowstorm up in Boston. And I brought a few machines home over the long weekend and I was stuck there. So I did all the testing in my dining room on about 3 different machines. And it worked awesome. I was thrilled. I was ready to go into work the next day and say we were ready to go and deploy the policy. But then came phase 2 of testing. And phase 2 was a whole laptop cart. So we took one of our schools, one of our middle schools, and deployed the policy to a whole laptop cart. And nothing worked because those machines were running 10.8 and the machines I tested on were running 10.9. And it totally threw me off and I was disappointed, but sort of having that courage to fail and succeed later, I took that to heart and we moved on to some more development in phase 3. And phase 3 was spot checking district-wide. So we made more changes, we deployed to a wider variety of machines, and we went to really various points in the district, hopped in the car, drove to this elementary school, that middle school, that other elementary school, different types of machines, different OSs, different wireless networks, all kinds of things, and trying to figure out what are the different variables involved here and where doesn't it work? And there were plenty of places where it didn't work. And then finally in phase 4 of testing, we had a pretty solid version of our policy, and I can't stress how important this phase was. We took the entire IT department to one of our elementary schools, and we did a practice test with an entire 5th grade, so about 90 students. And the teachers proctored the test as if they would normally, the students took the test as if they would normally, and we just watched. We didn't intervene. We just watched and saw how they used the technology and I actually took written notes. I took like 5 pages of written notes and everyone else did, and we had a debrief and we had like a 20-page Google Doc talking about all of our findings. And once again, we went back to the drawing board and we redeveloped. We took agile development to heart and we came up with what we thought was our final product. So the next step was identifying machines that we wanted to deploy. So not every one of our 6,200 Macs was being used for Park. Only about 1,600 of them were. So we had to figure out which machines they were, and we used the Casper suite to do that. Once we identified those machines, we created smart groups for them. We began the deployment. So essentially, we scoped the policy, and we checked the enable box, and crossed our fingers. But then, at first, we deployed it by saying, all right, it's going to be a once per computer policy. Once these machines get this policy, they'll be all set. What we found by more spot checking was that wasn't the case. There were plenty of machines that weren't all set because either the policy failed or the policy said completed, but a line in a script didn't take effect or something. And so we came up with this idea of defining a criteria for what it means for a machine to be ready for testing. So we took, and I'll talk a little bit about how we did that, but one of our steps was identifying those machines that were ready versus not for taking the test. Once we found machines that weren't ready, and we had done as much automated remediation as possible via policy, we did go out and do some manual checks and fixes just to make sure that every machine that was being used for testing from that phase of identifying machines was ready to go. We didn't want kids to have a machine in front of them that wasn't prepared for testing because it would have created unnecessary stress. And again, going back to that core value of supporting teachers and students, we really want to provide an optimal experience. There was some maintenance at various points. Java updates came out that messed things up, or actually toward the end of our park experience in Newton, there was something else with Java. I can't quite remember what it was, but we had a maintenance policy for these machines that sort of reinforced things that got changed and helped us push out additional settings that came up along the way. And then finally, support and monitoring. And so by support, I mean like tech support, like hands-on. We had techs in the buildings, like looking at things when they didn't work, and then monitoring from a district-wide JSS standpoint, looking at the logs, looking at the dashboard. We never really used the dashboard before. It was really key to figuring out our progress in this deployment. So the first lesson learned that we have was about getting hands-on testing, hands-on experience with the testing platform and the user experience. So we tried the test from the teacher's perspective and from the student's perspective, because ultimately those were the stakeholders who were going to be using our end product, was teachers and students. So we wanted to know exactly what their experience would be. We also tried to break the test. So anyone here work in IT and education? Yeah. When you have like 10-year-olds on laptops, especially those little 11-inch Airs that look so cute, there's lots of things they can do to break the test, intentionally or not. 3-finger swiping, Apple option escape to force quit, all those things, we tried to lock them down, but also we tried to put ourselves in the shoes of those students and break out of the test ourselves so that we could predict those things. And then also watching students and teachers and how they use the testing tools. So I talked about that experience at our elementary school where the entire department went out and watched. That was really, really key. I went out a few more times to other schools and watched the deployment early on to make quick fixes along the way. And then also how tech supported. So we did have techs in all of our schools during testing, and it was really interesting to see the things that they had to do or the processes they had to follow for fixing machines that inevitably didn't work for one reason or another. And so watching them was really useful in coming up with ways to help them do their jobs. The second lesson learned, and in hindsight we should have known this in the first place, was we had to do lots of testing and lots of soliciting feedback, and they kind of go hand in hand. So again, testing software, testing our final deployment from both teacher and student perspectives, deciding on an OS, so the PARC exam was web-based and also dependent on a bunch of plugins. So at first we started with Safari, and so I was talking about that dining room table testing, that was using Safari, and I was really excited. It was working awesome in Safari. I love Safari myself. It was my browser of choice. And then Safari was on, there were different versions across all the different OS versions. So we were running anything from Lion to Yosemite. So the version of Safari varied quite a lot amongst those ranges of machines. So I found that there was like one version of Safari on 10.8 that just wouldn't let me whitelist a plugin no matter what I did. It was a weird thing. And so we scrapped Safari, again, courage to fail, which is actually my next point. Courage to fail, take feedback, and throw away what does not work. We threw away Safari. We started from the ground up again with Firefox. It was a lot of work. I really didn't want to do it, but we did it anyhow, and it ended up being absolutely the right choice, 100%. One other thing I want to mention about testing is, admittedly, we didn't have a full JSS development and testing environment when we started off. But one thing that we learned through this process, and through talking with some folks from Jamf, was that we really needed one. And so one really nice thing that came out of this was we now have a full development and testing environment that we now stage most of our major changes in. So major changes to key policies. We're about to do an upgrade to 9.8.1, so we're doing that in dev first. So that came out of this project, and that was a really nice benefit of working with Jamf and getting their feedback. To give you a sense of the authentic experience of working in some of these schools, this was what we were working with. On the left there is one of our elementary principal's offices. We took it over so we could do testing in there. There was no other space in the building. In the middle, you'll see the copier. One of those machines kind of fell, but I caught it, so that was okay. Shh, oh, this is being recorded. And then on the right, you'll see a bookcase in a library. And I don't know where the books went from the bookcase. Luckily, those must have been checked out, so we had space to put the computers. But that's kind of what we were working with. It was like guerrilla warfare in the field. I literally worked out of that elementary school on the right for a full week, and the teachers really enjoyed it because whenever they had a tech issue, they were able to come see me, which was awesome for them. And it was awesome for me also to be able to talk to them and get their feedback in general about our tools and everything that we're doing to support them. But yeah, that was interesting. Another lesson learned was using Casper's reporting tools. And admittedly, when I first started using the Casper suite, I'm like, I don't have to run inventory every day. That doesn't seem like a necessary policy. And then I start getting into some of this stuff, and I'm like, well, I really want to know what's out there, and I really want to know exactly what's on there right now. And so Casper became key to identifying available hardware and software. So we have a naming convention for our machines where the first part of the name is the school building, the second part is the use, so like student or teacher or admin or secretary, and the third part is the asset tag. And we use those first two fields, the school and the use, to identify machines that we're using for Park. So any machine that at, say, X elementary school that had STUD for student as the use, so that we didn't have to deploy the Park policy and check for readiness on all 6,200 of our machines. We also, and I talked about identifying machines as Park ready. We also made use of scoping policies to remediate machines that weren't ready. So we had a criteria for machines that were Park ready, so like ready to hand to a student and use, and then machines that weren't. And so we were able to scope policies for remediation to a group called Not Ready. And until it was ready, it kept getting the policy. And so instead of having that once per computer policy and it being hit or miss, it kept running it until it got everything it needed, because sometimes some of those Java plugin settings and such just didn't take. And then another really important way that we used Casper's reporting tools was by sort of expanding access to the JSS and some of the saved searches to our whole IT department. So we really had to pull together for this project. It was a big project. And also we collaborated with the instructional technology staff in Newton. And they were all trained on how to use saved searches on the front page of Casper, of the JSS, when you log in. And that was really important for people who are building based to be able to say, well, how many machines in my building still need to be touched to be ready for Park? Or which machines aren't ready and, oh, have they checked in? I'll just have to turn them on and they'll get the policy. At the end of the first week of deployment, I took this picture and I posted it to my Facebook page because all of my friends know I was working on this. And there were 98 computers left out of 1,600 that were ready. I'm sorry, 98 that still needed attention out of the 1,600. So that felt pretty good. So there were only 98 machines that needed to be touched or remediated in some way after that first week. And some of those received that remediation through policy. Others received it manually through self-service. But it still felt really good to not have to touch the remainder of those 1,600. And then the last lesson learned was about supporting and monitoring the implementation. And a big part of that, as I just sort of alluded to, was filling in the gaps. So machines that weren't quite ready for testing, they had to be addressed some way. And so some of that was through that remediation policy. Some of it was by going out using those reports and then remediating by running the policy manually in self-service. But nonetheless, we had to fill in the gaps and make sure that every machine used for testing was 100% ready. Like I mentioned, we use self-service for those for remediation. So instead of waiting for a machine to get the policy, get the every 15 or whatever we had it set at, you could run the policy in self-service and have instant gratification. And I'll show you some examples of that in just a minute. And then finally, we found that documentation was key, not just for teachers, not just for students, but also within our department internally. So we had documentation for teachers about best practices for the machines, how to treat them, restart at the beginning of the day, log in with this account, don't do this, do that. For techs, we had a lot of documentation about what to do if something went wrong. So we created our own error guide, and I'll show you in a little bit how those error codes were generated. But techs could look at this guide, which was a Google Doc that was shared with them, and identify what was wrong with the machine and why it wasn't working based on these codes that, or rather descriptions that would pop up on the machine via Casper. So that was the part of the presentation that I promised would be the most useful, but now is the part that I think will be the most fun. And this first slide about the park policy was sort of the basis of our whole deployment. It was all about like this one policy that did everything and got everything ready. And we did choose to use a single policy and not a lot of different policies, using different smart groups and scoping, because to me it felt kind of like a checklist. And in fact, when looking online at how other districts were preparing for park and other online exams, I found an actual checklist that was a 3-page PDF, and it was the instructions for what students had to do when they got to the computer in order to prepare for testing. And it included things like going into system preferences, Java, changing security level, disabling the screensaver, making the machine not go to sleep. It was like literally 3 pages. And so this is sort of like a snapshot of what some of those things are that we automated. So we used the Casper suite and scripting and packages to do these things, because there's no way that I was going to ask students to do that or teachers, and there's no way I would do that. I wouldn't ask other people to do something that I wouldn't personally be willing or interested in doing, and I had no interest in doing this to 1,600 machines manually. So the park policy in the JSS looks something like this. I'm a scripter. I like to script things, and I talked about having a checklist. So one advantage to me for using script as opposed to lots of different policies and packages and scoping things is that I could go through the script very logically and say, first do this, then do this, then do this. Kind of like I was doing during that initial investigation phase, except I was checking it off electronically. Here's an example of what that script looks like. For any of you that look at the script online, I do have a link to it on that URL that I linked to. I showed earlier. None of it's pretty, right? I don't call myself a programmer. I call myself a sysadmin, and there's definitely a difference. And you might also say, well, couldn't you have done that differently in Casper? Couldn't you have done it that way? And yes, there are many different ways to go about it, just like with any deployment. And a lot of what you're seeing here is the 5th major version of this script. So we started with one called create park user. Then we had one called create park user Firefox. And then we had one called create park user Firefox ESR. And then finally we ended up with create park user Firefox ESR curl, which is a great name. Well, for me it's descriptive. It's not really great for anyone else. But we ran into issues with like HTTP distribution of packages and all kinds of things that had nothing to do with online testing. But we had to address those issues, and so a lot of those issues are addressed with some modifications in the script that you'll see. We also made use of smart groups and saved searches, as I talked about earlier. So smart groups were used for policies. So all of our policies, like that original park policy that you just saw, so which machines get the park policy. And then which machines get our park remediation policy. So we had a smart group called not ready, and that was the scope for the remediation policy. And then also for consistency, so that everyone was working with the same list of which machines were to be used for testing, we nested those smart groups in our saved searches. So in all of the saved searches that I made available to the rest of my department, they all use sort of nested group membership of some of those existing groups we were using for scoping policies. And that was really important for consistency. At first, we were just manually recreating all of the criteria and the saved searches. And then someone would say, oh, well, we're not using these 10 machines for park. And then I would have to go into all the different saved searches and change that criteria. So by leveraging the smart groups and the saved searches as its own criteria, that was really useful and saved a lot of time. In the end, we probably had 30 groups and 30 saved searches called park, and it was really confusing. So I made myself one in the end called absolutely park ready. And that was the one. That's the one that I was watching to see how many of those 1,600 machines were ready on my JSS dashboard, how many were green versus red. And you can see the scope on that policy is computer group is member of park machines and not a member of needs attention. So basically anything that didn't have a problem after running the park policy. And you can see some examples of other saved searches we had in smart groups, all for different variations of policies and different groups of machines, all of which were in use as part of this whole deployment. This one's really cool. This park ready extension attribute. How many people here use extension attributes already? Okay, so if you're going to deploy online testing, I highly recommend everyone in this room does that. Because I was talking before about how I'm like a checklist type of guy and I like to go down that list to make sure everything's ready. But how do I determine if something's park ready? So I scripted it as an extension attribute saying, is this value in this file? Is this app in that directory? Is, this plist have that value in it? And it was just a whole bunch of if statements. And if any of them failed, it would say ready equals no. And if ready equaled no, it would say that the result for the extension attribute was not ready. But here's the really cool part, and you can't really see it in that small screenshot on the right in this next slide. Maybe you can. Not just does it tell you if it's not ready, but it also tells you what's not ready. And those codes or those responses correspond to that error guide that I was showing you earlier for techs. So really all tech would have to do to remediate was run this self-service policy or wait for the automated policy to run again, because again, it was scoped to that group of machines that still needed attention. But at least, and particularly for me as the person administering this deployment, it gave me a sense of what actually wasn't working and to provide some context on that. So I sort of jumped ahead a little quick, but we made significant use of self-service for that remediation process, particularly when supporting the testing on site. So if a student had a machine that all of a sudden didn't work, the tech could open, or even a teacher, teachers got used to doing this, it was so easy. Open self-service, log in, we had a category called park that I featured this stuff in. First you run check park. When you run check park, it would pop up with that little Jamf display message thing. If it was ready, it would say, "This is ready!" exclamation point. And that's what we got, 90% of the time. But when something wasn't ready, it would say, "Contact IT. This is what's not working." So it would provide the tech some context about what's not working. But 9 times out of 10, they would just run that other policy you see on the right called park setup, and the machine would be ready by the end of that because it would go through that whole checklist of items again and fix anything that sort of went awry. And that's something to note, is that just because a machine was ready at first doesn't mean it stayed ready. So these machines were used in production, and we talked about one of the challenges being the diverse range of machines, but also the geographic location and use cases of them being in shared carts in schools. And so who knows what people are doing to these machines during the day. So they use one block for testing, another block for Google Docs, and then the next block for testing again, and it may not be ready anymore. Someone might have done something to it. And so that's why it was really important to have updated information about whether a machine was ready or not. Also those automated remediation policies, and then finally this manual remediation via self-service, so that if the the machine didn't check in time before, check in with the JSS in time before testing, someone could run this and fix it, and the student could go on their way with the test. This is an example of the instructions that we gave to teachers and techs for remediating. You'll see that's what it looked like if a machine was ready. It was very clear in capital letters, this machine is ready for park. And my heart was always sort of like pounding when I ran the policy, and when I saw that, I was relieved. It was like, a burden off my shoulders. And then this one's also really cool. So I talked about using that extension attribute to have up-to-date information about the status of my machines and whether or not they are ready for park. One reason I liked using an extension attribute was that it was a central single value I could look at to determine readiness. So instead of looking at like a bunch of different smart groups and this machine needs this and this machine needs that, I had a single value I could look at, and I customized my search view in the JSS, so I would always see that column, so it would say ready or not ready, and that was really useful. But because I wanted that information up to date all the time, and extension attributes only get updated at inventory collection, I found myself running inventory a lot. And that created unnecessary load on the JSS, and it also just seemed unnecessary to collect all that inventory information all the time. And so using a tutorial I found from Bryson's website about using the API to write to the JSS, I was able to create one that updated the park extension attribute using a script and some XML that it generated without having to run inventory. So I was able to run this script multiple times a day, and the load was like negligible. So that was really, really useful. So anytime any of my park policies ran, I ran this afterward. And now I've sort of extended this code for all kinds of things. I have, anyone using Active Directory? Yeah, so my machines get unbound a lot, or they get off the network and then it doesn't work anymore after too long, or the time has changed. So I have a smart group for machines that are having AD binding issues, and I populate that using this script, a very similar one for AD status. So very transportable, if that's a word, to other applications outside of online testing. So in the end, there's sort of 4 things that I want to leave you with today. The first is that collaboration is key. I'm standing up here in front of you representing Newton Public Schools IT department, but it wasn't just me and it wasn't just my colleagues in IT that made this successful. It was collaborating with all of our stakeholders, administration, teachers, students. In that scenario I talked about before, where there was a group of 3rd graders who did that sort of trial run of the test, I sat in front of them afterward and we did question and answer with them, all of the how old are you in 3rd grade, like 8 years old? With all the 8-year-olds, and they had really good feedback, and we made changes based on their feedback, so collaboration was definitely key. Also, and obviously we're at JNUC, so it's about Casper, leveraging the appropriate tools from the Casper suite. So I showed you that Wordle at the beginning of all the different tools we used. There are more tools in Casper that we didn't use, but we chose the ones that we thought would be beneficial, and there were really a wide range of those tools, but sort of like having a sense of what's available in Casper, what you can do with some of the Mac management tools, and thinking about how you would use them in your application. And then test, and keep on testing, and I had to write no pun intended because this is about online testing, get it? I know, lame joke, but sort of tying back to that core concept of Agile development, you have to be on your feet. You have to be changing things constantly based on testing, and this would have been a really, really unsuccessful initiative if we hadn't done so much testing. And again, all these sort of tie together. Collaboration was key to the testing. Casper was key to the testing. All of these were sort of important elements. And then last is sort of a balance between the big picture and the details. So at the very start, when we were investigating requirements, we looked at big picture requirements like locations of testing and how many students and that sort of thing. But then we also had to look at details, like was that little minute value in the Java config file correct, or was the window positioned in the part of the screen that on the 11-inch airs it wasn't cutting anything off. So we had to work on the details, and often in IT I think we're focused on the details, but then we had to take that step back and say, well, what's the big picture? And the big picture ties back to the teachers and students. So I asked myself, and my colleagues asked themselves, is this going to be good for the students? Are they going to throw the computer down the desk after going through this process, or are they just going to pretend like it's any other day in school and everything goes as usual? And it was the latter that we were aiming for, and that was really our big picture goal. So that's really all I have to share, and I hope that you guys have questions, and I'm happy to talk with you more. So thank you. App-based as in? Oh, yes. So the question was, because I talked about all the browsers and plugins, are we going to be going back to the client version of Pearson Access and TestNav? And my understanding is yes, from reading some of the stuff, some of the literature online, but I won't know until we're closer to that time. I really hope so. I really hope so. Yeah. What's the best way to... Oops.
There's one in the back, too.
Let's go back. Oh, show navigator.
Yeah.
There.
There's a question.
Over. Yep.
Kind of a simple question, but do you create a user that all the students use when they take the test, or do they use their individual accounts?
Awesome question. Yeah, so at the beginning, so the question was, do we create an individual generic user account for students to use for testing, or do they log in with their AD accounts? And the answer is we have a generic user, and here's why. There's a lot of preparation to that testing environment that we had to do. So a lot of the packages like filled the user's home folder and stuff like that. And so all of that, all of those files had to exist before the user logged in. And so we had to create an account ahead of time to do that. And the other thing is that it was kind of difficult to find ways to scope things in terms of restrictions and preferences that would be good for students' own accounts and also not interfere with their regular use of their own accounts, because they might log into that same machine later in the day but not for testing. So we did use a generic account, and it was local, as opposed to an AD generic account, because we had to have the home folder pre-populated with all of those settings.
I had a question. Did you use anything else to lock down the rest of the system, or is the browser or the part of the solution lockdown, like a lockdown browser kind of solution?
So the question was, did we do anything to lock down the system besides relying on Pearson's ability to lock down the browser? And the answer is we did a lot. And that goes back to that whole concept of breaking the test like a student would, or trying to. And we did spend a lot of time trying to figure out which gestures allow you to leave the test and which keystrokes cause a problem. And so we did do a lot of modifying ofplists that affected that sort of thing. And I also had a couple of launch agents going on in the background for some sort of custom restrictions, keeping certain processes from popping up that would have inadvertently kicked you out of the testing mode. So there was a lot of locking down we did, and I didn't post the launch agents on that page, but I'll post them too, because I think those could be useful, particularly if anyone uses Smart Notebook and it annoyingly pops up every time you log into the machine. And then even if you leave it open and you log into the Pearson site, it then thinks you're like trying to cheat, and it tells you you cheated. So you had to lock that one down, and that was kind of fun. So the question was, do we do anything to accommodate student accommodations outside of the Pearson environment, or do we rely on the Pearson environment? And the answer is there's a whole part of the Pearson Access site that the teachers and test coordinators use where they can add those accommodations. And so we didn't do any accommodations for that, which was actually really great for us because our old test that we had administered was MCAS, and we still had some schools taking MCAS this year. And so we had to have special accounts that would allow you to open Word but not have spell check, and sometimes you could have spell check, and sometimes you had grammar check but not spell check. And it was much easier to let the Pearson side administer those accommodations. That was one of the pluses of using online standardized testing. Yep.
Through all of this setup, how much did you actually work with the Pearson support with issues within your system, or was it primarily internal adjustments?
So the question was, how much did we work with Pearson support versus sort of internal development to support on this project? And this year, so this was actually our second year doing Park. We did the field test the year before. And the year before, I did talk to Pearson quite a bit because there were a lot more kinks in their product, I think. And they were really good. I worked on a Sunday one day to get one of our caching servers up and running, and they answered. And the guy who was in charge of the Mac deployments at Pearson for this product answered the phone because he happened to be on call that Sunday, and he was awesome. So the Pearson support is really good when you call. This year we didn't need it as much because we did kind of have that background from doing the field test in a smaller environment the year before. But also so much more of it had to do with, like, we knew what had to be done. It was a matter of how to use Casper and the tools available to us to make that happen. And Pearson had their own checklist too, but they weren't saying, well, upload this package to Casper and it will just work. They were saying, click all of these buttons. And so we sort of took their guidelines and tried to automate it. Yep.
Are there any Windows machines in the school's environment? So did you have to mess around with that at all?
So were there any Windows machines in our school environment, and did we have to mess with them? Yes and no. Yes, we have 900 Windows machines, and there's less and less every day. But my director made the choice to not test Park on Windows machines. And there were a few reasons for that. One is there's so far fewer machines, and so we didn't need to. We also bought a bunch of Chromebooks because they were cheap, and we were able to augment our MacBook Air supply with those. But also because our Mac management is so much better. And it's because of Casper, it's because of having Casper, but it's also because since we have 6,200 Macs and 900 PCs, we allocate many more resources to managing our Macs, and I'm certainly much more comfortable with it than I am with managing our PCs. And so it was a much easier experience to deploy the test on Macs than Windows boxes. And I did talk with some colleagues from neighboring districts, and they had a very hard time automating the process on Windows. And so it wasn't Casper necessarily as much as just the whole sort of architecture of OS X that really did make it possible to automate some of these processes. Yep.
Did you have a problem with Java updating right before any testing happened? Does it happen the night before the day of?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the question was, did we have any problems with Java updating at really inconvenient times? And the answer is absolutely. And one of the scripts that I linked to in that tiny URL site is something that I found on Jamf Nation by a guy named Andrew. I can't remember his last name. Maybe he's even in this room. Are there any Andrews here? Maybe, no. And it was called Disable Java Auto Update. And it was awesome. And it basically goes through all the auto update mechanism is run by launch daemons, and so it goes through all the launch daemons and launch agents involved, and it kills them, it unloads them, and then it deletes them. And I ran that as part of my Park maintenance policy that ran every day, because if someone went to self-service and installed Java again, it would reinstall those launch agents. So I would then run that script again. And so I kept disabling the auto update. There's also a second part to that auto update function that's not the launch daemon. There's a a feature, there's a security setting within Java's configuration file that checks for the last, for which version of Java you're running and whether it's like expired or something like that. Forgive me, I don't remember the details right now, but if you look in my scripts, there's definitely stuff that addresses them. And so we ran into that also. And so we set the Java client, the Java plugin to allow expired versions of the software too, so it wouldn't block us just because they came out with a new version. And we did use Java 7. We hadn't deployed Java 8 in our environment at the time, and we did all of our testing on a very specific version of Java 7. So again, in my scripts, you'll see some code that reflects wanting that very specific version, because I know that going one minor version off could have affected how the test worked. Any other questions? Cool. Well, I think that's it, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.